Okay. Well, we're at 90. I think that's a good place to start. Welcome, everybody. My name is Adrienne Gianforti. I work with Proof Strategies as a Senior Account Director, and I am here, very happy to be here with ComNetV to lead the discussion on our panel on equity in action, ways to authentically reach diverse audiences with your marketing strategy. A little bit of a mouthful. We're thrilled to have you here, even virtually, and this is a really important discussion to have. So we really appreciate ComNet for providing this platform for us to continue to have these conversations. And this is one in which we've had a little bit of experience with, specifically with a couple of our panelists at our DC Communicators event. So my job here is simply to guide the conversation, but I really am relying on the expertise of our phenomenal panelists. And what we would like to do is keep the Q&A to the side, and what we'll do is probably cut it at about 3:45, and we'll use the last 15 minutes to answer any pressing questions that you have. So please feel free to submit them as we go along, but I'll be selecting a few of those to address right at the end of it. So without further ado, first we have Karina Hertz, the Director of Strategic Communications at AARP, and I'll turn over to her in just a moment. And then Teresa Danso-Denqua, who is the Next Gen Manager of the initiatives for the initiative of Next Gen, Disability In, and Frank Trambo, who is the new VP of Communications and Chief Communications Officer at Howard University, who's new to our panel to just talk about this really important topic. So we're thrilled to have him here. And I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and a little bit more about what they do and their background, but I'd also like to switch it up a bit and have them actually tell me what they think authentic marketing is and how they would define that. So I'll turn it over to Karina first.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you, Adrienne. As Adrienne mentioned, I'm a Strategic Communications Director with AARP. This is my 10th year at AARP. I've been previously in the content and digital marketing teams within the organization. My background is primarily it's a traditional media, and then more recently, more in the marketing side of things with digital marketing and marketing management. So my team sits within the umbrella team of integrated communications and marketing at AARP. And my role is really to be the front door and the bridge between this larger ICM, integrated communications and marketing team, and the rest of the organization, just supporting the various communications needs that we have as an enterprise. And my areas of focus are primarily around our work and employment programs, as well as our audience work, which entails multicultural audiences, LGBTQ, and veterans. And for those of you who are not that familiar with the AARP, we are the nation's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with a mission to empower people 50 and over to choose how they live as they age. And for me, authentic marketing really is one of those things that it's hard to explain, but you know when you see it. It's doing the right thing when nobody's looking, is just doing things because you believe they are the right thing to do and not because you want to take advantage of a specific event or momentum that's happening to gain advantage from that. And I think we're going to touch upon that a little bit farther down the discussion when we talk about conversations on race and some of the societal issues that we're seeing. But I'm glad to be here, and thank you very much.
Thank you. And Teresa, how do you define authenticity at Disability In?
Hey everyone, as Adrienne said, I'm Teresa Danso-Denqua, and I work at Disability In. Many of you may not be familiar with their work, but we are the leading nonprofit resource for business disability inclusion worldwide, and we work with primarily the Fortune 500 in the US, working with about 220 companies across their full life cycle of products and marketplace. So we help with their hiring practices, we help with their supply chain, and then we help with them with their consumer and marketplace as well. And my role particularly falls in the former in terms of the companies that we work with and their talent strategy. So I really help to help them diversify their pipelines and find early career talent that has disabilities. And to do that, we run a program for college students and recent graduates where they receive career development, job opportunities, mentorship, and attendance to our annual conference, which is kind of the gathering place of all these companies across the US and in regards to disability inclusion. Additionally, our organization works on just increasing the greater awareness around disability inclusion in the workplace and creating awareness about disability in society as a whole. We're often forgotten about in the diversity scheme, and so we really want to make sure that people are aware of that 1 in 4 Americans has a disability, and that accounts for almost 61 million Americans. So as that number also continues to arise with an aging population, with the impact of COVID, it's really imperative that everyone sees themselves as part of the disability community, whether as a person themselves with a disability or as an ally who's really helping us to be inclusive and equitable. And to the question on defining authenticity, I think it's really around leading with empathy and really trying to genuinely connect with others in order to understand, value, center and celebrate their experience that might differ than your own. And it's also about being honest when where you are in your journey towards inclusion, honest on when you make mistakes and where there's room to grow. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, and that's kind of what I think about authenticity.
That's terrific, Teresa. Thank you so much for that. And Frank, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think is authentic marketing.
Oh, thank you. So just a little background, name's Frank Trambo. I am the current VP of Communications and Chief Communications Officer for Howard University. And so the gambit of the scope of my work here is really related to all marketing and communications on campus. So whether it's the overall brand management, press, public relations, our crisis communications, athletic communications, pretty much the full gambit of scope here I have at Howard. And I also, background-wise, I'm new to Howard, so I just came from Georgetown University too, where I oversaw the storytelling and strategic communication surrounded around all of our development and fundraising related marketing, which was a significant level for Georgetown University as well as I am an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies in the Integrated Marketing Communications program. So my background has been heavily in the higher education market, and the difference is also becoming from state institutions, private institutions, and as well now an HBCU has given me a really good scope of what it means to be authentic in a lot of different ways, whether it's from the state level, the private white institution, and now, of course, a historically Black college or university. One of the best definitions I've always used for what it means to be authentic, it really comes from the Journal of Consumer Psychology, and they define it as the extent to which consumers perceive a brand to be faithful toward itself, true to its customers, motivated by caring and responsibility, and the ability to support customers in being true to themselves. And really what that means to me is that when you're talking about authenticity, it's around no difference than a personal relationship you have. And can you engage in a meaningful and truthful and honest and genuine dialogue between whoever your audience is and what your organization stands for? And so I think at a brief level, that's really how I look at authenticity is thinking about that dialogue that you can create, and one that's believable and one that feels as authentic as you speaking to someone you love in your family.
That's great. And I agree with all of your responses. And I think that, it depends, right? And I think this is really a conundrum that a lot of leaders are dealing with in terms of how they represent themselves to their audience and whether or not they're taking missteps, either intended or not. And I think that's really where we want to anchor the conversation today. There was a word that you used, Teresa, that I really love about this journey that people are on, because it's very much that, right? We're still learning about this. It's not, I remember a year ago when we had this discussion at DC Communicators, I spent time sort of talking about what do we mean when we say equity? What do we mean when we say diversity and inclusion? and the words being sort of conflated. I don't think we need to do that right now. I think that people understand that EDI is so needed at this juncture for a variety of reasons, and we'll get into some current event stuff in a little bit. But talking about that journey, what have you all witnessed, and Teresa, if you'd like to start, organizations not doing it right, or what are some examples that you can think of that are bad habits that perhaps everybody falls into? It's a bit of a trap when they start thinking about their marketing strategy and as a leader of how they want to reach those audiences.
Yeah, I think it first starts with not recognizing the community that actually exists and trying to kind of create their own idea of what that community wants. So it's kind of the lack of outreach to and the lack of listening to the community at large. We find that a lot in the disability community, often in representation in the media. It's often people without disabilities acting or portraying people with disabilities, whether that's models or actors in movies and TV. And so we really try to talk with companies to make sure they recognize that there are disabled models out there, disabled actors that can be part of their product marketing and their materials as well. At the same time, I think it's also just being just accurate about where they are in starting their journey. If they don't have any people in their company that can really help them on their journey, then it's reaching out to disability organizations that exist that can consult with them and work with them along the way, and knowing that everyone has to start somewhere. So you're going to make mistakes along the way, but it's just owning up to it and then being able to move forward from what the lessons learned when you hear that feedback from the community.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. You hear about it a lot more now with movies, especially, or models that are not from countries of origin that they're supposed to be placed in, and LGBTQ and actors who are heterosexual playing LGBTQ. I mean, it kind of, there's a huge laundry list of complaints that you hear about. So that's really on point, I think. Frank, in regards to this journey, being in a new role at HBCU, to your point, what do you see as sort of critical juncture for the university right now, and how it's affecting students with, how to market to youth? You sort of have it's so twofold. You have a minority-led college, but also this sort of younger population. And I would imagine that's a bit of a challenge in your role right now.
It is. I think there's always a little bit of a disconnect between, the youth of how they communicate now versus even in the administration. But I think that, what Howard is doing has been really transformative in trying to ensure that they're, really addressing the point you made earlier, addressing the need for Black executives, the need for a diversified, trained and ready workforce, and providing that through, the education that it provides. Howard produces the most PhD graduates for African Americans. So across the board, we're producing those people. And I think Teresa, made a great point that the talent is there. I think one of the things that was illuminating, and I think a great example was something that came out this morning, was with Wells Fargo and the comment that the CEO made. And if you're not familiar, essentially, the CEO made a comment that was saying that he wants to have diversity and inclusion. However, the reality, and I will quote that, is that there's not a very good pipeline of people. And that's just not true. And I think that comment addresses really the particular issue that we have in marketing, which is being able to showcase that this talent does exist, and also to get companies to realize that there isn't a little bit of a misunderstanding of what is the difference between hiring someone who is, of diverse background that is qualified or just a white male. And I think that there's a difference there. And unfortunately, what happens is at that level, it is seen as more of a risk to hire someone who is a diverse person versus a white male. And I think that is where that disconnect happened. And that's why you have CEOs of companies that will make comments like that, because they just don't understand what it, or really equate that a qualified minority or diverse individual is the same as what they believe is, a current white male, which is the traditional executive that you see.
And you made a great comment in a previous conversation Frank and I had about risk. and how oftentimes there's a lack of impetus to hire someone who is not like me, frankly, and is not, something that they can recognize, and that unpredictability of that perspective they'll provide in the office space. I'd love to hear, just to share that again with our audience, just about, what do you mean when you say risk?
Yeah, so, I had a conversation with, and I'm going to refer to the higher education industry right now, but I had a conversation with some headhunters who were often, it was a conference. We were trying to discuss why there wasn't more minorities in these positions. And quite frankly, I had an example of someone I had worked with who had, had very unfortunate situations, had been fired from one job and then went to another as an executive, and then got fired for the same reason that he got fired for the last job and went to another place as an executive. And I couldn't understand why that person could continue to go forward versus I know plenty of educated and ready minorities who can fill those positions. And the headhunter said to me that essentially it is a risk. It is a higher risk for in the minds of the employers for them to hire a minority versus a white male that they kind of already know what their problems are going to be. That is that's a problem in the industry. There's more white men named John in advancement higher education roles in the in higher education industry than there are minorities. That's a problem. And we can't say, I think we really have to get past this idea that it's just about a pipeline or pool, because that's just not true. There's more diverse individuals graduating every single year. There's so many opportunities. There's more entrepreneurs out there. The pool is there. And I think that the conversation has to then be addressed that really the risk, the idea of what risk is, and overcoming that understanding with HR as well as the higher or the CEOs and executives needs to be addressed in that aspect.
Agreed. And Karina, with AARP, you represent such a wide swath of people in this country. To your point, the largest nonprofit, nonpartisan nonprofit. I'm curious about what you've witnessed as a part of your mission, how people of all different types of backgrounds, including their families and caregiving roles that they're in, what have you noticed as sort of things to lean into as far as marketing and reaching them, and things perhaps to avoid?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about bad habits, I think it's important to mention that they're often tied to very well intentions, very good intentions. People want to do something to reach multicultural communities or age diverse communities. And I think they fall into the trap that doing something is better than doing nothing. But I'd argue that even though it is important to have representation via imagery, for instance, that's kind of like a low hanging fruit tool for marketers, and it tends to be low cost as well. It's not going to be enough if your actual product or the core of your social mission is not speaking to the communities, right? It's going to come out flat. So again, there are good intentions in the outreach, but not fully committing to a strategy that takes into account multicultural and age diverse audiences from the get-go. It can do your brand more damage than good. Like a simple example is literal one-to-one translations, or even worse, Google translations are a big no-no, right? So really urging marketers to take the time to Transcreate, and by that I mean putting something in culture that speaks to the specific community you're trying to reach, both from a language, in the case of Hispanic Latinos, having an in-language strategy, as well as a cultural standpoint. And on the other hand, what I also witness is, you get so interested and eager to go out with a multicultural strategy that you easily fall into stereotypes. So it's important that you always consult the experts and the people who know how this community likes to be communicated to, so that they can advise you on a nuanced approach, that it's really what you need when you're trying to reach multicultural audiences. Because otherwise the true story of your brand will be your lack of understanding of the complexities of certain communities. And I think we've seen that more recently with the conversations around race, where the brands that were doing the work already could come out confidently and be part of the conversation, and those that just want to take advantage of what was happening at a societal level, it quickly backfired, right? So for instance, I'm Hispanic. I was born and raised in Latin America. And I tend to see now in the midst of Hispanic Heritage Month, a lot of imagery that is around Latino families sharing food. Yes, we love food, we love families, we're big on both, but there is so much more to us and what we have to offer. So really taking the time and effort to discover us more in depth, go in deeper, consumers will recognize it and it will appreciate it, and the authenticity of your brand will gain respect as a result.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And the listening component, I think we started out with Teresa's response is that, listening is so critical in the beginning, and this reactive nature, I think, is a great segue to sort of this current events that are going on. I mean, COVID-19, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, Black Lives Matter movement, the recent ruling on Breonna Taylor's case today there's a lot going on and to consider as a marketing professional, but just on a personal level. I think people really want to reach out while well-intended and ask questions and do something about it. I think oftentimes it doesn't always land or stick in the right way. And so in light of that, I was thinking about the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and specifically what that might mean for a majority Supreme Court bench. And how do you anticipate that impacting your strategies moving forward? And, is that something that is of concern for, diverse communities? And Frank, I'd love to start with you. Just from an education funding standpoint, do you think that there's cause for concern?
Well, I think that whenever you have the court sway, very heavily in a way that is not necessarily historically not swaying or have made decisions that are going to benefit you, I think there is always a cause for concern. Because it makes things more questionable. It makes the tie to the government even a little bit harder. And so, as we know, on the higher education market, we have students who, they're going to protest. They're going to say their minds. That's one of the wonderful things about the students across the country is, they have an ability to really learn their voice and be able to stand up for what they believe in. And I think that where we're going, at least on the Supreme Court side, is going to be an interesting, ride to do. Now, with that being said, I do think that wherever we go, it should not change our marketing strategies for what's happening on the Supreme Court versus who we are as an organization. Because I do believe that goes back to the authenticity or the authentic conversation we're talking about. You have to double down on who you are as an institution, as a company, as a business, and serve the people that you are here to serve. And I think that is one of the, regardless of what happens in those areas, we have to be very stringent about understanding who our market is. Who do we serve? At Howard, we serve minorities really across the board. It's not just Black individuals that come to the university. We have minorities, and really we specialize in producing African Americans. However, we have plenty of individuals that come here, especially in our med programs, in our STEM programs. And our goal is to be able to take individuals who have not been afforded those opportunities and really educate them to push them forward. And I think that when I think about the marketing strategies and where we need to go as the constant government changes, and while the Supreme Court decision will last pretty long, it still doesn't mean that we should vie and change who we are as an organization, what we stand for, and what we're willing to speak toward for our audience.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And the mission piece is something that I know we've talked about before as a group about, with COVID-19 especially, we saw resources sort of shifting towards addressing the immediate first wave of the pandemic. People are talking a lot about the second wave of the pandemic coming to the United States. Teresa, I'd love to start hearing about how the pandemic has affected those that you're serving, people with disabilities and functional needs, because that, I think that's an important topic for a lot of, and all these marketing people we have budgets to worry about, so it's where do those resources go and what's the most critical, or is it, speaking about a mission, does it make sense to shift away from the mission temporarily and focus on, say, something you're not familiar with, like public health services? And was that something that was perhaps a bit misguided initially? Because we saw a lot of organizations doing that at the onset. So How has Disability In been sort of dealing with the pandemic since March?
That's a great question. I think it's been a twofold impact on us. As a community, the disability community has been very affected by COVID-19, with many people who are immunocompromised, just at a greater risk for contracting COVID in the first place. And then also for their healthcare and caregiving responsibilities too being increased during this time. And of course, just a nationwide shortage of those who can provide caregiving and healthcare services to individuals who need that in the disability community. At the same time, we've also experienced higher unemployment, which the whole country's been experiencing, but people with disabilities in a healthy economy already have a double the unemployment than non-disabled peers. So in a pandemic, that's been heightened as well. And then for our organization, we are also seeing the impact it is on students. So many students have had to transition from being in colleges, being in schools, to now going back home. And there's accessibility issues, accommodation issues, internet access, and just overall access for students on that scale. And so we've kind of tried to address this with individuals that we work with, both the disability community as people with disabilities themselves, as well as the companies that are also facing how do you change and shift to the changing workforce that we're experiencing during this time. I think many companies are recognizing that remote work is a feasibility and is needed during this time, yet the disability community really has been advocating for flexible work, remote work options as an accommodation, and have been denied previously. So the pandemic in a way is causing us to rethink what it means to be a workforce and how do we make that inclusive for everyone, no matter location, which is a really important issue for the disability community. But at the same time, helping companies to see this as not as a temporary solution, but a long-term transition to making sure that everyone has access to the workforce. So that's been a challenge that COVID has taken on. And I think it's something that we have been looking and working with the companies we work with across industries to have listening sessions where companies are sharing how they're experiencing this, how they're working through these practices for their employee base, and then also sharing across companies within industries too. So we've kind of been that the mediator of those conversations for companies that have worked with us and are members with us, so that they can have those conversations to really make sure that they're keeping disabilities at the forefront of the issues that they take forth.
It's really interesting, and all the more reason now that everyone can be remote working, which we're proving today, that there's nothing stopping them from hiring people with disabilities who can have access to a computer at home. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly.
Karina, same question. Curious about, not just with the aging population, but just in general, how AARP has dealt with the pandemic and how it's affected your operations and thus your communications with those communities.
Yeah, well, so Frank mentioned something that I think describes very well what happened to AARP, which is basically we double down on who we are as a brand. And we continue to focus our efforts with a sense of urgency, of course, in response to the pandemic, around health security, financial stability, and personal fulfillment. So one of the challenges that we saw is, we're a big organization. So we usually have various levels of review and approval before we're able to put consumer assets out there. And so it challenged us to be more nimble, to streamline our processes so we can really get help to people fast. And actually our brand equity saw a lift in response to that. People trusting the brand. We already had a very strong brand trust, but the fact that we were just working faster and quicker than ever to get these key resources to folks that were calling us concerned about their loved ones in nursing homes and what does that mean for their health and how they can continue to monitor them with not being able to see them in person or visit them in person. We heard from older workers concerned about losing their jobs, a lot of them being employed for the last 20, 25 years. And we know that for older workers, it takes at least twice as long to re-enter the workforce. So that was a big concern as well, not only on how the unemployment rate might affect them as a result of the furloughs and just the big kind of issues that companies were just laying off people left and right, but also our job doesn't stop there. So when we enter hopefully a recovery period, what does it mean for older adults who already were delayed into re-entering the workforce in a very competitive, unstable market? So unemployment was big for us. We did several satellite media tours, just trying to use the media as a platform to convey just emergency resources for workers, for caregivers. And also we knew that we had to protect older adults against fraud, just because historically we know that scammers tend to increase their activity when there are situations of heightened stress and anxiety, and obviously the pandemic was providing that. And older adults are more vulnerable, especially in a situation of isolation. So fraud was also one of the core issues that we activated during this time. And we continue to stick to what we do, what people know that we're going to be advocating on their behalf for. And we continue to inform. We had a weekly teletown halls with experts, being the conveyor of important information, health experts, members of the VA, for the different audiences that we serve, including veterans. So it was kind of like doing things on the fly. It never gives you that certainty that you know everything. So it was very much finding what we need to do next and kind of tweaking the focus and adjusting and refocusing what we do. But we always stood with alignment with our core mission areas.
And addressing really specific needs, it sounds like that, we're kind of very unique to your audience. The listening component kind of keeps coming up. Frank, understanding that, a lot of debate about students coming back to campus, students leaving campus again because there's an outbreak, and it kind of goes back and ping pongs back and forth. What are you using as a mechanism to communicate with students right now, or is that, and their families as well? Is there any particular tools that you're relying on mostly, or is it sort of depends on what's at hand?
Yeah, I wish there was some specific tools that engaged everyone at the same time. Of course, we're using the basics of email and ensuring that we have a place for. We built out a specific place in our reopening plan on our website, so therefore that you can come and get up-to-date information about it, whether it's our COVID testing dashboard that allows you to know how many people on campus have been tested and who's positive. That's going to be even more apparent. Right now we don't have students on campus, or many students I should say, and if we do embark trying to bring them back in the spring, whenever that happens, we'll have to make sure that we have that policy there. And I think what's unique about Howard is our president is actually a current a surgeon and physician too. So what that gives us a unique perspective, because of course on the health side we're very in tune, and we also have a hospital attached to the university. So that helps us where other schools don't necessarily have that type of connection into the administration all the time. But in case of of how the students are there, we're ensuring that we are communicating with them on a regular basis. We have information coming out from our provost all the time about what's going on, and then of course we have our digital space that we hold that information for.
Great. Yeah. I would be remiss if we didn't move quickly over to Black Lives Matter. So I want to make sure that we talk about this, and it really does kind of end us on a nice note over the next 10 minutes or so to talk about what can communications and marketing leaders be doing now to ensure more equity and diversity and inclusive practices, and how can those be better represented to the market, beyond the authenticity? Are those opportunities realistic? As I think that it's part and parcel to what's going on in our society today, in that if you're not seeing more diversity out in the market, you're not going to be able to shift your thinking about how, say, these court rulings play out, or how we should rethink about race and our own sort of struggle with racism, or being anti-racist is sort of like the new approach to this. I'd like to talk about how we diversify leadership in that vein, that spirit, in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. So, Karina, I think that it's also something very much impacting the Latinx community as well. So I don't necessarily want to isolate African Americans in this conversation either. I think that minorities writ large there's an opportunity to really think about what can we do right now as leaders in our roles in a position of power to help move the needle. What are your thoughts in terms of what you think would be most useful, or something that people could have as a takeaway today?
Yeah, I think, the key word that you use is position of power, right? And so AARP as an organization is in a position of power, and we want to use our voice for the things that we care about. So to address Black Lives Matter specifically, AARP is a strictly nonpartisan organization, and we've always been. But we strongly believe that helping put an end to brutal, unjustifiable, and often deadly treatment of African Americans is neither liberal nor conservative. It's simply the right thing to do. And listen, we have the track record to show that we've cared about racial injustice for as long as we have been founded. We've addressed it and racial injustice and disparities for decades, including in federal and state legislative advocacy efforts, legal advocacy and programs, services, and more. So I think this really provided us an opportunity to use our power, use our voice to talk about this issue that we simply don't see as either, again, conservative or liberal. So we did activate our voice when, back in the summer, and we continue to do so, just talking about the importance of solving for this very critical societal issue. Just on the increased diversity point, I think we recognize more than ever, perhaps, that it is important to have representation at the leadership level. But for whatever reason, and we can blame explicit bias or implicit bias in the recruiting industry and whatnot, it's not happening at the rate that it should be. But on the positive side, I think the timing is right to continue to have those conversations that allow us to re-examine how we see the importance of diversity. Obviously, those of us who serve diverse communities know how important it is, but I think we need to continue to influence, in this case particularly, recruiting strategies so they can really understand how critical it is to have multicultural mindset and different points of view from the get-go when you're creating marketing, communications, and any other sort of consumer efforts, because it really will just benefit brands. We know that. So how do we get there? I think it remains a challenge.
Frank, I think you said at one point that it's kind of laughable that brands aren't doing more of it because there's real dollars on the table that they're leaving by not doing it, right?
Right.
And what does that mean? I don't expect you to rattle off the exact value, but what are your thoughts on sort of what money's being left on the table right now for fundraising or for profit companies?
Well, I mean, just the volume alone, if you look at the Hispanic Latino community becoming the largest, population group just in 20, 25 years on the road, it's a matter of survival, right? So your general population, the makeup of your general population will dramatically change. And if you're not speaking to them now, if you're not serving their needs now, what makes you think that your brand is going to either one, survive or be considered relevant the time when that makeup of the population changes so dramatically. And the same with older adults. We see that all the time. There's discrimination across many areas as it pertains to older adults. And that's also an important population that has a lot of economic power. And so there's value in inclusivity. And there's no downside to it, really, there isn't. It's just a matter of making sure that you can allocate the resources. In the case of big corporations, that's not necessarily an issue. So there are challenges for smaller businesses that want to do that, but there's definitely no question about the importance of doing it.
Yeah, and it's economic power and voting power, I would say, as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes.
I want to mess with that population in that regard. Frank, you said a statistic to me last week that really struck me about the fundraising for Howard University versus Georgetown University, and just in terms of the question of resources and how you, that is just a point of comparison. And so when I talk about real dollars left on the table, I think that's something a lot of nonprofits are struggling with. I don't know if anyone quite realizes, or perhaps they do, but the dichotomy of what white-led institutions are incurring a year versus, say, an HBCU like Howard University.
Yeah, and I think that like a Georgetown University will raise anywhere between 150 to 200 plus million a year in fundraising support. Whereas Howard University, up until a few years ago, their largest year was raising $10 million. It's only been very recently in this past year where we've done a really good job of engaging a lot of philanthropists who have supported the university at a lot larger level, and hopefully we'll be the first HBCU to say that we've raised $100 million in a year. And we're close to doing that right now in the first quarter of the year. And but that's a rarity. And that's also from, a lot of wonderful philanthropists that are really one-off gifts a lot of time. And I think so there's a difference between who your core foundational support is and versus what are a lot of one-offs at the present moment. And we're so new into that fundraising realm and getting to those levels that it takes a while to get sustained. And I think that to a point you made earlier, we live in a world where it's really two different worlds. As a minority in this, in America, we have no choice but to engage with every single person that exists in America. As a white male in this society, and often even as a white female, you don't have to engage with a minority or someone of diverse background. There's many people who grow up and the first time they ever have to do that is in college. I went to Michigan State University undergrad, and there were many individuals that for the first time of them interacting with someone who was diverse was in college. So whereas I've had to, we've all had to interact with everyone on the daily basis. So what that means is the intentionality that you have to have in fixing this problem goes beyond just marketing, because as a marketer, we cannot make a statement that our company can't back up. We can't make a statement that we're about caring for individuals who have been underserved and communities who have been underserved if we have no programs that are actually helping those communities. And if that's a part of your target market and a part of your audience, then you're going to miss that authentic line that draws the two together. And when you think about what your company can be doing right now, especially in the higher education field, is, does your company have a pipeline to students of diverse backgrounds, to an HBCU where they're producing the highest, amount of PhD students that are out there? Do you have those pipelines built in so that when you do have internships, when you do have hiring practices, it's not a token hire? This should be an intentional way for you to understand that the quality of individuals is just as high and oftentimes higher in value to you because you want to live longer in this relationship. And when we think about fundraising, the great part about a HBCU, of course, is that we exist because of the injustices that have happened in the country. But if you're not an HBCU, you're the diverse audience you have as students, as you diversify your current population, is normally different than your large gifts. Your large gifts have been coming from individuals who have a lot of wealth, and wealth disparities already mean that most of those individuals will be white. That's right now. The entrepreneurial rate of Black women is growing on a substantial basis. Again, the PhD students who are growing at an exponential rate, that in 10 to 20 years from now, when most people will have accumulated their large wealth gaps here, that's going to be the audience that you're missing right now. And as Karina pointed out, if you're not talking to them now, if they don't feel authentically connected to you now and knowing that you have been intentional about actually helping, then you're going to miss that market. And then 10, 20 years from now, you're going to be an afterthought for where those philanthropists are going to be giving their dollars.
Yeah, so again, real money being left on the table. If there's no other takeaway today, it should be that. And you made a really great point, and it's a quick sidebar, and I want Teresa, just very quickly, would love to hear your perspective on that. But it's fine that there are people of color, people who are of minority or diversity who are being put into these equity, diversity, and inclusive roles at companies, chief diversity officer, what have you. But there's a load of other leadership roles that people of different backgrounds could be filling. There's nothing stopping you from appointing a CFO who's a Black man. There's nothing stopping you from appointing a South Pacific Asian woman as a CEO. And having that diversity of having power in that role offers a lot of value as well. Certainly could add to that authenticity we keep coming back to. And Teresa, to that end, the recruitment pool, as far as what you're hearing from companies, listening to them, and we have a question actually from the audience about listening, so I think this is a nice segue to the audience Q&A. what tools are you using to listen to them, and what are they providing as feedback in terms of money that they might be losing as a result of not diversifying their workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think companies really struggle with where to find disabled talent. Oftentimes they forget that they might have workers with disabilities in their workplace who may have invisible disabilities, who they're not reaching out to, not highlighting, not valuing, or including in their company culture. And so sometimes we start with companies to actually survey their employees within. There is federal legislation out there called Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act that makes federal contractors and subcontractors are required to survey their workforce, to voluntarily self-disclose that they have a disability. And there's different ways that companies can go about doing that, but it really just shows is that sometimes companies overlook the population that they do have, but then it goes beyond that. The regulation also encourages people to really be part of pushing the needle on making good faith efforts to reach out to the disability community. So companies are often struggling with that. And that's where they come to us, as we have a great talent pool of disabled students, recent graduates, early career professionals who are all well equipped to take on the roles at some of these companies. And so it's really about seeing the person first and recognizing that oftentimes living with a disability has made them be more adaptable to different things in the workforce, and being able to see a skills-based approach on that too. So surveys definitely help with their existing workforce. The other thing is really reaching out and engaging one-on-one with individuals with disabilities in the community setting. Many companies have had little exposure. I think Frank touched on that, exposure to people of difference, whether that's someone who's a minority, someone with a disability, whatever it might be. It's a lack of exposure and then knowledge. And I think that's where some of that risk that was mentioned earlier in the hiring process comes in, because they're not as sure of what the talent will be because they may not have seen someone with a disability go through their talent pipeline before. So that's where really having outreach really helps. And companies in the past have done this in a variety of ways. There's been focus groups, there's been listening sessions, conversations, things that we can help facilitate, but also just the idea that you have to be reaching out. There's a lot of great disability leaders who are out there advocating on social media, on different channels, on the value and the business case for hiring people with disabilities, but you really have to have sometimes at the same time, as a start at the top, with leadership, having to see that value and to recognize that it's not just inclusion. I think either Karina or Frank had mentioned, it's not just inclusion in the hiring space, but also what does your supply chain look like? There's disability owned businesses that you could be working with. How are you connected to those? What does it look like in the marketplace for your consumers, for your products? How are you making sure those are accessible? And how to make sure that everything that you're producing as a company is accessible for everyone. So there's a variety of ways companies can tackle it, but the answer is definitely not that the talent doesn't exist, because it does. It's just about how are you seeking out that talent from different channels and thinking more holistically and inclusive about where you're finding your next hire.
I think that's great. Thank you. I think that addresses that question nicely. And I think is a great segue to this next question we received from Yvette about how do you communicate to leadership that perhaps the brand framing, or if they go to the about page as a minority and it doesn't seem like their value set or the way they're representing their organization is reflective of you. How do you shift that framing? And I think it's a great question for Karina, because again, you have to encapsulate such a large amount of people. How do you create a messaging framework for your organization that can be sort of all encompassing and make people feel as though that's going to be an inclusive environment, an accepted environment for them to either work at or just to have a membership with, or what have you?
Yeah, I think it's really kind of making the case, and it shouldn't be needed, right? You shouldn't have to make a case for something that's so blatantly obvious and needed. But in the case of AARP, for instance, we have programs, programmatic teams and leaders that do this work day in and day out for the various communities that we serve. So for instance, there's a multicultural group, multicultural leadership group, there's a veterans and military programming group, there's an LGBTQ group. And so they are the number one advocates day in and day out for the work that they do and how they need to be represented in the overarching communications strategy and consumer strategy that we have. For smaller organizations, I think maybe just writing some examples on how people are tweaking their language to be more inclusive, whether that's starting with the HR department or with leadership. It will depend on infrastructure of the organization, but I think just pointing it out, you'll be surprised, especially again, the timing's right, people are talking about this. So you might be surprised at how open they are just to make sure that there's inclusivity in the language besides imagery and the product itself.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's right. That I think there's an opportunity to speak to leadership. It would be now. We have a great question from Bridget Hanna, who's in upstate New York, so my area. So I'm really glad this came through. Frank, how do you feel about the tactics of universities that are in rural, predominantly white environments to focus their marketing on urban students who are predominantly students of color? Is it ethical for them to sell their city as diverse, inclusive, and welcoming to students of color when that may not be the case? How should universities be considering the off-campus environment of these rural communities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it is a challenge. You know, the one thing, it goes back to a comment I made earlier. As a person of minority, or at least minority descent, we know what the world is. We grow up having very different conversations about what it means to leave the house and what areas we're going to be in as soon as we're at least out of the protection of our home. I went to Michigan State University, and the first day on campus, as I was walking down the street outside of campus, a truck pulled up with a group of what I think were actual students, but they said, "Go back to Detroit," in word, and then drove off. So that wasn't a surprise to me because I went up there. And at Michigan State's term, they didn't sell me on the city being diverse. What they sold me on is who they are as an institution, what they believe, and what education I was going to get from being a part of their institution. So then it goes back to really thinking it's not about always the area that you're in. When you're really talking to those individuals, what programs of support do you have for them? Are you asking them to come to your university and not give them support? Because that's a scarier conversation. That's a harder message to have. But to know that we understand the world, and here's what we're doing to make sure that your experience at our university is great in these fields. This is where we're going to try to get you to. Here's the way that we're going to make sure that you're successful. That's the conversation. That's the marketing that will speak to that household, to know that when I leave, when I send my child to an area that I already know is not the best for my child, that I know that the organization has their back, because the world is already not going to be a place that's going to be just open arms at all times. Most of the cities aren't. And so that's just a conversation that I think is more about what you're going to do as an organization and what support system you're going to have as more of a marketing appeal.
Yeah, that's really critical. We could have a whole other panel discussion about that, I'm sure. I think we have time for one or two more questions. And we have a great one. I know we've talked about this before, Teresa and Karina, about imagery. Teresa, what are some tangible tactics to prioritize representation without tokenizing marginalized groups? And that comes from Rachel.
That's a great and difficult question. I think it all comes back to authenticity, and it really is reaching out to the community to make sure that you have representation that reflects the diversity also within that community. I think Karina talked about it earlier, that a lot of the imagery that she's seeing is around families, around food, and that there's so much more to the community than just that. And one thing that we struggle with in the disability community with disability representation is that it's not just the wheelchair. That's kind of the placeholder for a handicap symbol, what you see on a placard for a car. But there's so much more to the disability experience than just those with physical disabilities that use a wheelchair. And so there is a fine balance. Oftentimes when we do see that representation, it's often the hospital type wheelchair that, you know, has the little arm handles, and many people with disabilities don't use in a day-to-day setting. And so it's even the little differences there. But it could be someone who uses a walker or a cane, or someone who's blind. There's just different ways that people can show disability that recognizes the full scope. That there's people, we used to say, like, if you've met one person with a disability, you've met just one person with a disability, and it's not endemic of the whole community. And so that is what kind of makes our community maybe a little bit difficult to, put a picture out there for, but that's where it comes from. The focus groups, the outreach, talking with different disability influencers that can really help, because it shows that there is an actual commitment. Companies that have done this well, I think of Microsoft with their Xbox game controller that was made accessible for people with physical disabilities, that I think they had a spotlight in a Super Bowl ad a couple years ago. They did a great outreach to the disability community to listen to the concerns of with their product, to really understand how it was being used, and then to also have a representation of someone with a disability actually using their product in the end. And I think it was just a great example of it kind of works both ways, of that you're trying to reach, you know, a product or whatever you're trying to market, but you're also trying to listen to the concerns of the community and incorporate them in as well.
Great. And I think this is a good conversation with regards to resources too, right? How do you capture that imagery and afford that, especially if you're kind of a strapped nonprofit, which is our final question from our audience from Caitlin. Karina, what advice would you provide for a small nonprofit, limited, or even a small business with a limited resources in maybe they can't do a satellite media tour or pull in external experts to do a multicultural campaign, but what can people be doing that perhaps is an internal resource that can support that effort to ensure that their marketing communications is multicultural and authentic, of course?
Yeah, I mean, if you have a diverse staff, leverage them and use them, and pressure test different concepts, because at the very least, what you can do, and that would be very beneficial for your brand, is not to be tone deaf to certain audiences. So maybe you're not doing an active outreach effort to target your product, your service, your organization to a specific community, but you don't want to be in a situation where you are not only not speaking to them, but you're actually offending them. So it's very important that you pressure test your consumer assets with people inside the organization. That can be kind of that sounding board when you are coming out with something. And I love what Teresa said about imagery, because I think if used correctly, I do think it's a very low cost tool that you can use effectively. The challenges that we see there, you know, we've come a long way since 2014 when Cheerios put a commercial featuring an interracial family, and they got an incredible amount of criticism. But we're still very much featuring communities of color in silos. So we tend to feature the Black family, the Hispanic family, the Asian family, and we don't show them mixing. Again, up to 15% of new marriages is between a white person and a non-white person. So to the extent that you can reflect that new reality, that new makeup of the American family, I think there is some authenticity in there as well that not a lot of people are doing right now.
Great. We have 1 more minute, so I wanted to ask this question as a closing thought. And Karina, I'll start with you. What do you hope to see in marketing in 2021 that you're not seeing now?
Wow, that's a good question. I think more of what we're seeing, what we saw this year, where companies are kind of overcoming their fears and making a stand for what they believe is the right thing to do. I know that certain organizations, like I mentioned, AARP is nonpartisan, and sometimes there are some themes that we've kind of not shied away from before, but we've definitely taken great caution as to how we talk about them. But it has come to a point where, again, we really need to use our power. And I just would like to see brands to continue to use their power and their voice and stand for the things that are right.
Teresa.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think something that we're facing as a community is inclusivity in technology. As a move to everything's virtual and digital, we really have to make sure we're not leaving anyone behind by not making sure it's inclusive. So how are you reaching audiences with physical or visual disabilities who can't navigate your website because they use a screen reader and it isn't accessible to their screen reader? How are your images being accessible from having image descriptions? How are videos having audio descriptions and captions as well? And so I think that's a new frontier, is making sure that it's accessible for everyone. And I think the accessibility space is something that many people are just getting on that journey. And so there's a lot more work that I can see in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And Frank.
You know, one of the things that I think is important is I want to see the insights for our marketing messages become a lot deeper. As Karina and Teresa have both pointed out, if you've done your marketing correctly, it's hard. It's not easy. If you've gotten to a message very easily, then I don't think you really got to the insight that's going to drive someone, can drive consumer behavior. A great example of that is, you know, Karina talked about families and food and how Latinos are sometimes just put at that aspect. You know, what a surface level marketing message would be, just using my family as an example, we tend to always be in the kitchen when we're together. And so, and you can have a house as big as the world can be, but we'll still be in the kitchen. We'll find ourselves there. And the surface level marketing will put something out that's something related to, you know, we like to be in, you know, eat food together. That is too low of a bar of what the messaging really is, because you haven't dug deeper to realize that, you know, the real insight is that that this is a place where we feel safe. This is a place where that we speak to the idea that that family is an area that we don't have to worry about the other things and the other problems that we have. At this moment, we feel safe. I want to see that the insights inside of all of our marketing is really backed up in digging deeper and using data and research in order to do that. And whether you're a large organization, if you don't have the diversity, you need to hire a firm that goes out and digs for that. And if you're a nonprofit, you don't have a lot of money, you can connect yourself with a local university that has students in marketing programs who are required to do capstone projects to go out and actually do this work for you for free. There's always an option. And so I want people to do the extra step this year and really try to dig deeper into their insights.
It's a great place to end. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us in ComNet V. This has really been a terrific conversation, and more to come. Thank you again.